Welcome! In this series of videos, we will cover the design and implementation of a project, from initial design through coding and development to testing, using the PowerBasic Windows compiler. Today we will continue our project to create our own web browser by fixing a problem with images within tables. This was our application at the end of the last video. In our browser, we have an index page. And on this index page are a number of links. If we go to page 8, we will see we have the image of our NAS, and further down we have a table containing that same image. As you can see, the image is encroaching slightly on the second column. So obviously the first column is not wide enough to contain the image. When I first saw this, I assumed it was a problem with the left margin. We have a slight margin at the beginning of the cell to allow the image to be moved over slightly. I assumed that if we increased the width of the column, this would work quite nicely. However, the problem was more complex than that. We can see it easier by updating this page 8 to contain another row. Currently in our HTML pages, we have a nas.png file. If we open this up, we can see this is our image, which is 200 by 112 pixels in size. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to paste in two new files. An updated nas.png, which you will see is larger than the previous one. This is 250 by 140, and I've made the additions in a block color so that we can see it more easily. We've also amended page 8. If we have a look at page 8, in a normal browser, we can see there is the increased size of our image. And in the normal browser, it handles it quite nicely. So we want our browser to do exactly the same. So let's go back to our index page and reload page 8 and see how it behaves. As we can see in this table at the bottom of the browser window, the image is encroaching much more into the second column. And the image below, the original image, is fitting quite nicely within the column, despite us not having changed any code whatsoever. So the problem is more than just a margin issue. The problem is, now that I have looked at the code, we are not working out the width of any of the images at all to fit them inside a cell in the table. So let's have a look at our code to see where we need to make some changes. If we hit the F2 button, we get a list of all the functions and subroutines within our application. There is a function called width of table. The purpose of this function is to work out the width of a table for each of the columns contained within that table. So this function is going to have to change. There are three ways a table can be drawn on the browser window. First of all, it can be dynamic. The width of the column is based on the data held within that column. Secondly, the table can be a percentage of the width of the browser window, for example 50%. And finally, the table can be a set number of pixels wide. This particular table on this particular web page is dynamic. It's driven by the data within each of the columns. Whichever cell is the widest is the width of the column. And this is driven by this variable, scaled equals false, which means it's going to be dynamic. If we look at the code, we will see we are stepping through each of the columns one at a time. And for each of those columns, we're looking at each of the rows within that column. And at the moment, we're looking for the maximum length of text in each row. So we're not actually determining the width of any image held within that column. And that's the change we need to make. So in order to make this code a little tidier, I'm going to add a new local variable called cell contents. This will contain the contents in text of the cell. And down in this section here, where we're looking at each of the rows in turn, we're going to populate this variable. This will make the following code a little easier to follow. So before, where we're working at this value here, this is in fact the cell contents. So we will take that variable and we will put that in place. That makes the code a little bit more easy to read. So having determined the contents in text of the cell, we now have to work out whether this particular cell contains an image or not. So we can test that by testing the cell contents variable. So this test here, where we're testing the cell contents variable, looking for image source. If image source is found in that string, then we know we're doing an image in this cell of the table. Otherwise, we know that it's just text and the original code can continue. So if this is an image, we need to store the widest column. So we'll need a new function to work out just how wide this image actually is. So we will populate the table columns array with the value that is returned. Looking at the maximum value currently held within that array and calling our new function getWidthOfImage. We need to pass a number of parameters to this new function. First of all, the cell contents. This will tell us the name and location of the image. Next, is it coming from a web page or is it local? Which tab has been selected? And finally, the handle of the dialog itself. Some of this information we have already, for example, the cell contents. This additional information is going to have to come from the function that called this function. So let's sort that out first of all. If we look at the parameters passed to the width of table, we'll see that some of these variables are not passed to this function. For example, is web page, tab selected, and the handle of the dialog. So let's first update the parameters of the call to this function to add those extra parameters in. Of course, now that we've changed this, we're going to have to change the calls to this function to add in these extra parameters. So let's have a look at where they're actually called. So there is a call to our width of table. This is in the display table function. The display table function is the one which first calls this width of table. So we need to add these extra parameters in. So in this function, display table, we have these extra parameters already populated in variables. So we merely have to add them on to the call to width of table. And there they are added. So now we have to look at creating this new function, getWidthOfImage. So here is the skeleton of our new function, getWidthOfImage, with its 4 parameters. The purpose, as I said, of this function is to return the width of an image. This will allow us to position it correctly on the cell of the table, giving the table itself the correct width for that cell. Much of the code within this new function is going to be copied from the displayImage function. As the displayImage function loads the image up, works out how wide it is, and positions it on the screen. We're going to be doing most of that functionality within this new function. So we're going to create all the variables we did in that function. So here we have our variables: the start position, the source of the image, the width and the height. The image width is what we're going to be returning from this function. We need to load it into a bitmap, so we need to have the handle of our bitmap, and we need to know the full path to where the HTML file came from. So as we did in the displayImage function, we're looking inside the cell contents for src equals. And then, is this a web page? And we will be calling the loadImageFile function, which is held within one of our libraries, the loadJPEG as bitmap. It will return true if the file has been found and false if it has not. Additionally, it will populate 3 output parameters: the width, the height of the image, and the handle to the bitmap. Having loaded our graphics, we can then reattach to our graphics control, the browser window. And we will return the function, which is the width of our image. So will this give us enough to display on our screen the width of a column correctly? Let's try running the application and see if it compiles cleanly, which it does. So let's go on to our web browser. And if we go down to page 8 and open that up, and we'll make our window a little bit bigger, we can see that on our table at the bottom of the screen, are showing two images, and both images are fitting within the width of the column. So it would appear what we've achieved today is we have widened our column to fit the size of our dynamic window. So let's just make sure that none of the other pages have been affected. If we go to page 5, these are tables which are half the width of the original control. If we refresh this, it will be widened. And we have a second table which is a fixed width in pixels. And we have a table underneath which has no borders. So those appear to be being displayed correctly. So all of our other tables, whether they have images in them or not, appear to be displaying correctly on our browser window. So in summary, what we've done today is we have corrected a problem with displaying images within cells within tables. So the width of the image is now being correctly determined and is driving the maximum width of a column within a table. There is, of course, more to be done within tables. For example, the text in here, data 5, 6 and 7, is currently appearing at the bottom of the cell rather than being vertically centered within the cell. However, we'll leave that bug for a later video. That's it for today. Thank you for watching.